Hello, friends. Let's talk about trauma. This is Trauma Talk number 5. And I want to talk about developmental trauma and what does that mean. So in my previous 4 videos, we kind of introduced what trauma is. We looked at different types of trauma, whether it was personal or relational or global recognized traumas, what kind of big T traumas are and what we call little t traumas, and how significant they both are. Then we started to introduce dissociation. What is dissociation? We hear this word and a lot of people don't really quite understand it, but yet all of us actually dissociate to some extent. And the more trauma we have, the more dissociation that would occur. And it's natural, it's adaptive and human when something is traumatizing to dissociate. The problem is that the brain and the neural networks in the brain can often lodge on to that and continue using the dissociation way past the usefulness, and then it later can cause us problems. So we will in future videos talk more about dissociation, how that comes up and how that plays. But today I want to talk about developmental trauma and what does that mean. So if we've talked about and we've kind of looked at like global traumas that are recognized as really significant traumas that, globally we all recognize, right? So whether it's genocide, war, veterans, military, and some of the violent experiences that they have themselves or see with other people, rape, so we all identify those as traumas. And then we talked about personal traumas, and there is a whole array of personal traumas, and then there's relational and attachment traumas. So as we introduce, what do we mean by developmental traumas? Well, as humans, we have developmental milestones that we meet as we're growing and as we're aging. And so from the time we're born, we start meeting these developmental stages. And if there's trauma, and so in developmental trauma, we generally will say anything for sure before 7 years old. And I don't even know if the cusp even goes beyond that, right? But anything that occurs before we're 7 years old, the brain just doesn't have the capacity to take on overwhelming situations like it does when we're older. And I mean, it really doesn't even until like age 24 or 27 have like full capacity. And of course we know that even traumas that occur after that age can still be overwhelming and cause trauma. But so now think of this, young, before the age of 7, whether you're 0, 6 months old, 3 years old, 6 years old, how vulnerable children really are. So with that said, I do want to also say that children are extremely adaptable and resilient. So there is this kind of dialect in there is, they're very resilient, and at the same time, they're very vulnerable. And that is true. So the world is not always easy. And if children get their needs met consistently most of the time, or even over 50% of the time, and they have attunement, meaning that there is care that comes, or there's repairs for situations that scare the children, or there's someone there to care for them and to really be with them in a way that they need, they can overcome these traumas. So they do have a lot of resiliency. So I don't want to paint the pictures that kids are so fragile that in normal situations or, that they're going to be traumatized, right? But at the same time, they're very susceptible because their brains haven't fully capacitated to the ability to really process information the same way. And so if we go back to my favorite, most simple term to trauma is too much, too fast. Too much is coming at us in some way too fast. And so for a child, that's overwhelming. And again, if they have someone there that can attune and help them regulate when they're before 7 years old, because before 7 years old, we don't know how to regulate ourselves. So children can't just, and this is really mammalian, children and baby animals and young animals, they don't know how to regulate these overwhelming situations. So they need their surroundings to be able to help them. And if they're helped and they can be soothed and regulated, from the environment around them, the trauma is released. The trauma is moved through. So yeah, it was overwhelming for their poor little brains, right? And bodies, whatever the experience was, but it can be moved through, right? However, and this can happen in a wide range. So I really want to make that apparent because I think it's important, is that when too much too fast comes on and there isn't an attunement in someone else before the age of 7 to help learn regulation, because children learn regulation through their caregivers and through the close people and environment around them. And then somewhere, once they get older, they can start self-regulating, but they only learn the self-regulation if the environment is attuned enough to them and if the repairs come in when the attunement isn't there. Okay, so now let's look at children that don't have that environment that's conducive to being able to help them to learn the self-regulatory and be able to regulate. So when the environment doesn't meet that, and let's say it's just too overwhelming of a trauma and the need can't be met, so that in whatever way it didn't, and that created the trauma, or it's just ongoing relational traumas or different things that are going on and there's just misattunement in the environment, and so they don't learn how to regulate these experiences properly. They don't get the soothing, the attention, the protective, because what's really needed is nurturing, protection, soothing, regulating. Right? So if that isn't met, like if it's not met at least 50% of the time in some kind of consistent way, or repaired when it's not met, right, then the child doesn't learn the way to, they miss these developmental milestones of how do I start to even regulate on my own. So now they're my age in their 40s, or they're in their 20s, or they're in their 60s, or their teens, and they cannot regulate. And when we can't regulate, that's what I call hell. We all think of what, if you know the word hell, and it doesn't really matter what your belief system is, if you know what that word means, it just means atrocious. Like, we don't want to be there. No, this is awful. So when we can't regulate experiences coming at us, emotional content, it's horrible. And we will, as humans, adapt and we'll find a behavior that will help us regulate. And sometimes those behaviors are really maladaptive behaviors. But it's the only way we learn and know how to then regulate, because we never learn that. We miss that developmental milestone. So now we get back into developmental trauma. Developmental trauma is missing those milestones. And then, of course, you keep growing and aging and you never hit that milestone. And so, of course, traumas continue to happen. So with people that have developmental trauma, and sometimes we'll call that the trauma bond, if you think of it from an energetic standpoint, relational standpoint, but it's also the sense that that those developmental milestones weren't there, can't really regulate. Well, that is traumatizing in itself. So they continue to be traumatized throughout their life because they don't have this ability to tolerate enough to learn the regulation internally. And cognition doesn't work. It's not enough. If there is these missed developmental milestones, we have to go back and it's like building a house on a structure that's unsolid, right? We have to go back and build that solid structure. So the good news is it can be done at any age. The hard part, and what sucks, let's just say that totally sucks, is that it takes work, it's hard, and you have to find the right kind of situation to relearn, or maybe it was never learned, so to learn how to be able to regulate, and you can't do it on your own, unfortunately. And so that is a really, our society always says, do it on your own, just, it's all in your mind, all these really invalidating things. And that's not true. So now let's go back to the developmental milestones. Like why are they not met? And there's many reasons. So if there is any abuse before the age of 7, and of course, abuse beyond that is also traumatizing, but we're still talking about developmental here. So any abuse, any sexual abuse is just crucial. It does not matter, whatever, however, any kind of sexual abuse, it actually turns on circuitry in the brain that really wasn't supposed to be turned on yet, and it's extremely confusing and cannot be regulated in a really efficient way. And so those children that experience this have to fragment, in order to survive. Any psychological abuse, really confusing, is going to cause damage. Any severe abandonment before the age of 7 that's not, that can't be processed and understood. Neglect is huge as well. Very, very huge. Neglect for children under the age of 7 is so significant for their developmental milestones. It's so necessary. So again, that fragmentation and different things has to happen. Physical abuse. So any of those categories, but let's even see that it goes beyond that. Some children, what we call empathic children, and all humans have the ability to have empathy, although you've met people, and I've met people who they don't have any empathy. That's a whole different thing we can talk about, but really all humans have that capacity. However, some people are more energetically open, susceptible. There's, biological things that we can see and marker this, and there's certainly other aspects of this that we see. So these sensitive children, and they're born that way, they are a little more sensitive to the energy and the emotional situations that are around them. For them, it doesn't even necessarily have to be as strong as abuse to really create problems, right? Because they're so attuned and they're not even aware that they're picking up all this information that maybe is even more information than some other children would. So this is also a vulnerability to this if there's misattunements and things that aren't being done. And of course, with any child, if there are attachment issues. So if the parents themselves carry trauma or intense experiences that they can't regulate, so the parents have trauma or they've missed some developmental milestones and can't regulate, this can be carried on in the child, because the child, again, especially sensitive, more empathic children, but this could happen for any child, because again, children are more open and susceptible and vulnerable, that the parents' attachment style is not what we call a secure attachment, because they didn't learn it. They have some developmental trauma, or they had something happen for them. So they have what we call anxious attachment or avoidant attachment or disorganized attachment, or these different attachment styles. And for the child, that creates this misattuning. So the child, unfortunately, it's like trauma conditioning that continues to happen from generation to generation, is the child then again doesn't learn that attunement that was necessary to kind of be able to regulate. And so then they therefore also do not meet these developmental milestones. And those parents may not be abusive at all and be very well-intentioned parents, that they just themselves don't know how to move into that. So that's experiences. Medical traumas are huge. So children that go through medical things, it's just so invasive for the body and the mind and the energy and the psychology, and the little person can't really regulate that. And so that can be really difficult situations where we see fragmentation and we don't have an understanding. Why would they be but when we go back and they have a medical history that, they needed it. it. So it's not invalidating that they didn't need the medical services or the surgeries or the whatever happened. So that's an area that really needs a lot of attention for people. Adoption, huge. It's a disruption in the attachment, no matter how well-meaning and caring and nurturing and protective the adoptive parents are. There's always going to be some developmental piece, and some adoptive children have more problems than others, certainly, and whatnot. And certainly going into a good environment is going to help them build that secure attachment, and they can, but they do end up with this deficit because they know, even though it's not cognitive, they don't remember up here. Their right brain and their body remembers that abandonment. And so there is always going to be something that, and again, these things can be worked through. So I don't want to sound like this is desolate. It can be worked through, but it's hard. You have to do the work, and you have to figure out how to kind of work through with somebody that understands those types of traumas and how to work with them. So we go back again, this developmental trauma, it can come from, really well-meaning things. I'll give you an example too, is, for years and even today, so many people, and remember, this was the belief that you left a baby crying. That could be enough to not sometimes meet a milestone. Some children maybe had more issues with it than others, and sensitivities, and there could be so many different other things going on in the environment. But we now know that to leave a baby just crying and crying and crying, and then they stop crying, well, they do eventually stop crying. But what happens is the baby shuts down. So the nervous system just has to shut down because that need isn't met. And this creates it just creates this environment for the possibility of trauma to start setting in, and the baby doesn't know how to regulate, because again, babies do not know how to regulate on their own. So that's not a good thing that they just shut down. And I know many well-meaning parents have done this over the years. I mean, it was believed that that was the right thing to do, and it came from really well-meaning intentions, and it was prescribed. I mean, doctors would say, just let the baby cry, let the toddler cry, let them just, work it out. But the thing is they're not really working it out. So the new science shows, no, they're not really working it out. They're shutting it down, and now they're learning that, and they'll continue to do some of these things throughout life. So that's problematic. If a baby is crying, that baby needs something. And sometimes we don't know what that is, but we can try. And even trying can just be enough, right? Like, we may not know if it's heartburn, or if it's, something hurts, or if they're hungry or they're tired. So you just try, like, okay, well, I'll rock, or I'll try food, or I'll try to burp, or I'll try to do this. And that in itself can be an attunement. So you don't have to be perfect. And I don't want to paint that picture, because none of us are perfect. None. I mean, that's just, not reality. And like I said, babies are resilient. Toddlers are resilient. You can also repair, like say that a child, you show up and the child is really scared, but you didn't get there for 5 minutes because something happened or something like that, then attune then, and that's a repair. And that can help them regulate. And so again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but they need something. There's a reason they're crying out. And this attunement, they need that secure, attachment and whatnot. So I really encourage, attachment readings, understandings, these kind of things. And I'll continue to hopefully provide more information. But that gives you a little bit of an idea of developmental attachment. So thank you. And I hope these are really helpful.